Today, we're covering 10 cold cases from the 1980s that sat unsolved for decades until answers arrived that nobody saw coming. These are the breakthroughs, the confessions, and the truths buried under time. Let's start. Case 1. Stella Gonzales, Althea Oakeley, and Kaitlyn Arquette. In July 2021, a security guard at the University of New Mexico found a man sitting outside the children's hospital. He was wearing a GPS ankle monitor. He was injured. He was intoxicated. And when the guard asked if he was okay, the man said he wanted to confess to 3 murders. His name was Paul Apodaca. He was 55 years old. And over the next several hours, he would connect 3 cold case killings in Albuquerque that nobody, not the police, not the FBI, not the most famous mystery writer in America, had ever linked together. To understand why these 3 cases sat unsolved for more than 30 years, you have to understand each victim. Because these weren't connected by evidence or geography or timing. They were connected by one thing nobody could see: the man who chose them. The first was Althea Oakeley, June 22, 1988, a Wednesday night around 8:15 p.m. Althea was 21 years old, a University of New Mexico student from Arroyo Hondo, a tiny community near Taos. She was bubbly, confident, full of energy. Her friends adored her. Back home, she'd competed for the Taos Fiesta Queen title. She had a boyfriend. She was finishing her degree. She had everything in front of her. That night, Althea left a fraternity party after getting into an argument with her boyfriend. She was upset. She decided to walk home, cutting through the campus and heading down Buena Vista toward the house she shared with her brother. It was a walk she'd made before. She never made it. Someone attacked her on the sidewalk and stabbed her 4 times before running off. Althea collapsed on a neighbor's doorstep. She was rushed to UNM hospital where she died. Police investigated. They looked at the boyfriend. They looked at the argument. They looked at everyone close to her. But none of it led anywhere. The attack appeared random, vicious, and personal all at once. And with no witnesses and no physical evidence tying anyone to the scene, the case went cold within a year. Here's the detail nobody caught for 33 years. At the time Althea was killed, Paul Apodaca was working as a security guard at the Technical Vocational Institute, which is now Central New Mexico Community College. He worked on the same campus where Althea went to school. He wasn't a stranger lurking in an alley. He was an employee walking the same grounds. And when he finally confessed decades later, what he told investigators about that night was chilling. He said he saw Althea and planned to rape her, but she smiled at him, so he stabbed her to death instead. That was his reasoning. She smiled at him, and police never connected him. 3 months later, September 9th, 1988, about 1:15 in the morning, 13-year-old Stella Gonzales was walking with a friend along Central Avenue near Tingley Beach. They were headed home. A car pulled up. The occupant fired shots at both girls. Stella was hit in the back of the head. Her friend survived. Stella was rushed to a hospital where she died 2 days later. She was 13, a kid walking home with her friend in the middle of the night. And the case got almost no media attention. No witnesses came forward. No motive made sense. The shooting appeared completely random, and the investigation stalled almost immediately. 10 months after that, July 16th, 1989. A Sunday night around 10:30 p.m., 18-year-old Kaitlyn Arquette had just graduated from Highland High School. She was smart, trusting, planning to start at UNM in the fall. That evening, she left a friend's house and got into her 1984 red Ford Tempo to drive home. Somebody pulled up alongside her car and shot her twice in the head. Witnesses saw her car cross 3 lanes of traffic and slam into a telephone pole. When paramedics reached her, she was slumped over the steering wheel. She was rushed to UNM hospital where she fell into a coma. She died the next day. Now, here is where Kaitlyn's case took a turn unlike anything in the other 2. Because Kaitlyn's mother was Lois Duncan. If you grew up in the 80s, you know that name. She wrote I Know What You Did Last Summer. She wrote Killing Mr. Griffin and Stranger with My Face and about 40 other young adult novels. She was one of the most successful thriller writers in America. And when the police told Lois Duncan that her daughter's death was a random drive-by shooting, she refused to believe it. Not because she was in denial, because she was a mystery writer. She looked at the evidence with trained eyes, and she decided the investigation was inadequate. So she started her own. Duncan threw herself into the case with everything she had. She hired private investigators. She talked to Kaitlyn's friends. She even consulted psychics, and she uncovered something that seemed to confirm her worst fears. Kaitlyn's ex-boyfriend, a young man named Dung Nguyen, had been involved in a bunco insurance fraud scheme connected to a Vietnamese crime ring operating in Albuquerque. Duncan became convinced that Kaitlyn had stumbled onto the operation, and the gang had ordered a hit. She wrote a book about it, Who Killed My Daughter, published in 1992. It was a bestseller. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in January 1993. The whole country learned Kaitlyn's name. Duncan also wrote a second book, One to the Wolves, in 2013. She appeared on Good Morning America, Larry King Live, Inside Edition. She built a website dedicated to the case. She spent 27 years chasing the theory that organized crime killed her daughter. She was wrong. Every lead she followed, every psychic she consulted, every connection she drew to Vietnamese gangs and insurance fraud was a dead end. Duncan was brilliant. She just couldn't see what nobody could see. The truth was so much simpler and so much worse than anything she imagined. While all of this was happening, Paul Apodaca was living his life. In 1995, he was convicted of raping his 14-year-old stepsister and spent 11 years in prison. In 2012, he was convicted of attacking his girlfriend and stealing her car. He was sentenced to 12 years but was released early. The man had a long, documented history of violence against women, and not once did anyone connect him to the 3 Albuquerque murders. And here is the fact that should make you angry. On the night Kaitlyn Arquette was shot, before ambulances arrived, before police secured the scene, Paul Apodaca was there. He was on the scene. He approached a detective, gave his contact information, and walked away. A private investigator hired by the Duncan family later focused on Apodaca as a suspect for years, but the police department never made the connection. They let him walk. Lois Duncan died on June 15, 2016. She was 82 years old. Her family said she'd never stopped investigating. She'd never stopped asking who killed her daughter, and she went to her grave without ever getting the answer. 5 years later, Paul Apodaca sat down with that security guard outside UNM Children's Hospital and started talking. When police began interviewing him, the confessions came in waves. He admitted to killing Althea Oakeley first, then Stella Gonzales, then Kaitlyn Arquette. He knew details about each crime that only the killer could know. The thing that ties them together, that connects 3 crimes nobody ever linked, has nothing to do with evidence or geography. It wasn't about the victims. It wasn't personal. It wasn't organized crime or insurance fraud or anything rational. Apodaca told investigators his motive was, in his own words, all the hatred that I had for women. He said he'd grown up watching men treat women badly, and that anger built over years until he started killing. He targeted women who were alone, women in vulnerable positions. An Albuquerque police deputy commander later confirmed that Apodaca had no connection to any of his victims. He picked them because they were there. When investigators asked Apodaca what had prompted him to finally come forward, 33 years after the killings, he gave an answer that is almost too cruel to believe. He said he'd read Lois Duncan's book, Who Killed My Daughter? The book that Duncan spent years writing. The book that laid out every wrong theory, every bad lead, every dead end. The book that represented the single most exhausting act of love a grieving mother ever committed. The killer read it. And 5 years after that mother's death, her book is what brought him in. Think about that. The answer Duncan spent her entire adult life searching for was a man sitting in a prison cell reading her own words. She wrote a book begging the world to help find her daughter's killer. The killer picked it up. There's something else about this case that almost nobody talks about. Two young men, Juvenal Escobedo and Miguel Garcia, were originally charged in connection with Kaitlyn's shooting. The charges were eventually dropped because police couldn't connect them to the gun or the crime, but their lives were destroyed. 18 months of suspicion, legal proceedings, and public scrutiny for a murder they had nothing to do with. Apodaca's confession didn't just solve the case, it confirmed that two innocent people had been dragged through the system for no reason. On January 25, 2024, Paul Apodaca appeared in court via video link from Lee County Correctional Facility. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder, 2 with firearm enhancements, 1 count of kidnapping, and 1 count of attempted rape. The families of all 3 victims gave impact statements. Stella Gonzales' mother, who had waited 35 years for this moment, looked at the screen and said, "You have no idea what you took from me. Since the day you killed her, there's an emptiness in my heart that can never be filled. May God forgive me, but I hope you go to hell." Kaitlyn Arquette's sister Robin stared at the man on the screen and said something that I think captures the horror of this case better than any statistic or timeline could. She said, "You just are indescribably unmemorable. That is the part that haunts me. 3 women dead. A best-selling author consumed her remaining years chasing the wrong answer. 2 innocent men had their lives upended. And the man responsible was so ordinary, so unremarkable, that he sat in plain sight for 3 decades and nobody looked twice." There's one more piece to this story. When Albuquerque Police Chief Harold Medina received the news that Althea Oakeley's case had been solved, he did something a police chief almost never does. He got in his car and drove to Taos to tell her parents himself, because Medina grew up in the same community as Althea. His mother was the seamstress who fitted Althea for her Taos Fiesta Queen outfit. As a teenager, he watched Althea walk through his mother's shop, full of confidence and joy. 2 years after her death, Medina became the first recipient of a scholarship Althea's parents set up in her name. He carried that case with him for his entire career. And on the day it was finally solved, he drove home to deliver the news face to face. Paul Apodaca was sentenced to 62 years with 45 years of incarceration. He will die in prison. 3 families waited more than 3 decades for that sentence, and the author who fought hardest for answers never lived to hear it. Case 2. Shannon, Lloyd, and Renee Cuevas. May 21st, 1987, just before midnight, a young woman's roommate walks into their shared house on Donna Lane in Garden Grove, California, a quiet residential street in Orange County between Anaheim and Santa Ana. She heads toward the bedrooms, and she finds 23-year-old Shannon Rose Lloyd dead in her bed. Shannon had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Garden Grove police responded to the scene that night and processed the bedroom for evidence. They collected DNA. They canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed every person who lived in that house because Shannon rented a room in a home she shared with several other people. Somebody should have seen something. Somebody should have heard something. But nobody did. Not a single witness came forward. The roommates reported nothing unusual that night, and nobody recalled seeing Shannon with anyone she didn't know. Shannon was athletic. She loved horses. She loved riding. Her friends described her as funny, with an adventurous spirit, the kind of person who made a room more alive just by walking into it. Her older brother later said she was tough, that she wasn't scared of much, and that it was hard for him to fathom how anyone could take another person's life like it was nothing and just discard them. The investigation burned through every lead it had within weeks. Without a witness, without a suspect, and without a match for the DNA collected at the scene, Garden Grove detectives had nowhere to go. Shannon Lloyd's case went cold. 21 months later, February 19, 1989, early morning, the body of 27-year-old Renee Cuevas was found along Lambert Road near the El Toro Marine Corps Air Station in Irvine, about 20 miles south of Garden Grove. She had been strangled. She had been sexually assaulted. The scene looked eerily similar to what had happened to Shannon, the same type of violence, the same absence of witnesses, the same dead-end aftermath. But nobody in law enforcement was in a position to see the pattern. Renee's case belonged to the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Shannon's case belonged to Garden Grove Police. Two different agencies, two different filing systems, two different sets of detectives working two separate investigations with no reason to compare notes. And like Shannon's case, the investigation into Renee's death produced DNA evidence, but no suspect. The investigation turned up no witnesses, no clear motive, and no connection to anyone in her life who would have done this. Her case went cold too. Two young women, two separate cities, 2 years apart, two different police departments, nobody connected them. There was no obvious reason to. Different locations, different circumstances, different victims with different lives. If there was a link, it was invisible, and it stayed invisible for 16 years. In 2003, the Orange County Crime Lab revisited evidence from Shannon's murder using updated forensic testing. They developed a male DNA profile from the biological evidence collected in her bedroom in 1987. Then, they ran that profile through their system, and they got a hit. Not to a suspect, to another crime scene. The DNA found on Shannon Lloyd matched the DNA found at the scene of Renee Cuevas' murder in 1989. One man had killed both women. The same person who broke into Shannon's bedroom in Garden Grove in 1987 had killed Renee Cuevas in Irvine in 1989. Two cold cases were now one cold case, and for the first time in 16 years, detectives had something concrete. They had a DNA profile for the killer. They knew his genetic fingerprint. They just didn't know his name. So they submitted the profile to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. Every convicted offender, every crime scene sample on file, all cross-referenced automatically. If the man who killed Shannon and Renee had his DNA in the system anywhere in the country, CODIS would find him. It didn't. No match. The profile sat in CODIS for 18 years. Every time a new offender's DNA was added to the database, the system checked it against every unsolved case on file. Year after year. Nothing. Whoever killed these two women had never been caught for a crime that required a DNA sample, or at least that's what it looked like. The case stayed frozen. That changed in 2021. The Orange County District Attorney's Office had recently built an investigative genetic genealogy unit, a team specifically designed to use genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, to crack cold cases. The technique works differently than a standard database search. Instead of looking for an exact match, it takes the unknown DNA and uploads it to a public genetic genealogy database. Then it searches for partial matches, relatives, people who share enough DNA with the unknown profile to be family. From there, investigators build a family tree backward and forward until they find the person whose DNA fits. Garden Grove Police and the DA's office submitted the killer's DNA profile. The genealogy team went to work, and eventually, the family tree pointed to a name: Reuben J. Smith. Smith had lived in Orange County during the 1980s, right in the area where Shannon and Renee were killed. But he'd moved to Las Vegas sometime after 1989, and that's where his story takes a turn that makes you wonder how many more victims there might have been. In July 1998, nearly a decade after Renee Cuevas' death, Reuben Smith attacked a woman in Las Vegas. He sexually assaulted her and tried to kill her. The same pattern, the same violence. But this time, something was different. This victim fought back. She fought hard enough to break free. She survived, and she reported the attack to Las Vegas Metropolitan Police. Smith was arrested on charges of sexual assault and attempted murder. Now, here is the detail that matters. When Smith was arrested in Las Vegas, police collected a DNA sample from him, standard procedure during a felony arrest. That sample went into the system. It sat there, and the charges against him for the Las Vegas attack were eventually dismissed. The reasons aren't entirely clear from the public record, but the result was that Reuben Smith, a man who had killed at least 2 women and tried to kill a third, walked free. 1 year later, in 1999, at the age of 39, Reuben Smith killed himself. So let's lay out the timeline, because it tells a story that no investigator could have pieced together at the time. In 1987, Smith sexually assaults and strangles Shannon Lloyd in her bedroom. In 1989, he kills Renee Cuevas near the El Toro Marine Base. Sometime in the early 1990s, he moves to Las Vegas. In 1998, he attacks a third woman. She escapes. He's arrested. His DNA is collected. The charges are dropped. In 1999, he takes his own life. And here's what nobody knew until 2021. That DNA sample from his Las Vegas arrest had been sitting in the system the entire time. The genetic material that could have connected Smith to Shannon and Renee was available from 1998 onward. But nobody matched it. Why? Because the technology wasn't there. This is the part most people don't understand about DNA evidence. Having a sample and having a usable profile are 2 different things. At the murder scenes, the biological evidence wasn't clean. It contained DNA from multiple sources. Shannon shared her house with several people. The crime scene samples were a mix, and in 2003, when the lab ran the evidence, they could confirm the same unknown male was at both scenes. But they couldn't separate the mixtures well enough to produce the kind of profile that would match a sample in a different database from a different state. It took 2 more decades of advances in forensic science, advances that came even after the Golden State Killer breakthrough in 2018, before the technology could handle what this case required. Orange County Sheriff's investigator Robert Taft said the science was growing by leaps and bounds. Because the DNA investigators had collected genetic material from multiple sources at the crime scenes, it wasn't until the most recent updates that scientists could separate out the other sources and narrow it down to Smith. When all 3 DNA samples were finally compared, the match was conclusive. The man who killed Shannon Lloyd, the man who killed Renee Cuevas, the man who attacked and tried to kill a third woman in Las Vegas, all the same person, Reuben J. Smith. But Smith had been dead for 23 years by the time investigators said his name out loud. On July 26, 2022, 35 years after Shannon Lloyd was murdered, Orange County officials held a press conference to announce that both cases had been solved. Garden Grove's deputy police chief stood beside the district attorney. Shannon's family was there. Renee's family was there. The room was full of people who had waited decades for this moment. This was the second cold case homicide Garden Grove had solved using genetic genealogy in the span of a single year. A technology that hadn't existed when Shannon and Renee were alive was rewriting the history of their deaths. And the answer both families got was the name of a dead man who would never sit in a courtroom, never face a jury, never hear a sentence. The Orange County District Attorney, Todd Spitzer, said something at that press conference that stuck with me. He said justice does not have an expiration date. And then he said something else. He said law enforcement should stop using the term cold case entirely, because with the advances in DNA technology, every case is potentially solvable. Whether that's true remains to be seen. But for Shannon Lloyd's family and Renee Cuevas' family, the word solvable meant something different. It meant 35 years of silence followed by a name they'd never heard before, attached to a man who'd already escaped the only punishment that mattered. Shannon's brother captured it when he talked about his sister. She was tough, he said. She wasn't scared of much. And then he said the thing that cuts through all the forensic science and the press conferences and the timelines. It's hard for me to fathom how anyone could take another person's life like it was nothing and just discard them. That's the word that sits with me. Discard. Because that's what happened twice. Shannon in a bedroom in Garden Grove, Renee on a road near a Marine base in Irvine. Killed and left like they didn't matter. And the man who did it moved to a new state and kept going until his third victim refused to die quietly. The family said the resolution brought relief but also frustration. They knew who. They knew where. But they'd never know why. Reuben Smith took that answer with him. And somewhere in the background of this story, there is a woman in Las Vegas whose name has never been made public. The woman Smith attacked in 1998. The one who fought back. The one who survived. She's the reason his DNA was in the system at all. Without her, without that fight, without her decision to report what happened, there's a real chance Shannon and Renee's cases would still be open. She didn't just save her own life that night. She saved the answer two families had been waiting 35 years to hear. She just didn't know it yet. Case 3. Anna Jean Kane. October 23, 1988, a Sunday afternoon in rural Berks County, Pennsylvania. A motorist is driving along Route 662 near Perry Township when his car runs out of gas. He pulls over, gets out, and starts walking, looking for a gas station or someone who can help. The road cuts through wooded countryside, 5 miles east of the small borough of Shoemakersville, along a stretch called the Unknowingly Trail. At about 3:15 p.m., walking along the south berm of that trail, the motorist finds something in the brush that stops him cold. A woman's body, partially hidden in the undergrowth. She has baling twine around her neck. She's been beaten, she's been strangled, and she's been dead for roughly 12 hours. Her name was Anna Jean Kane. She was 26 years old. She was a mother of 3, a girl and 2 boys. She had been living in Hamburg, a small borough in Berks County, but had moved several times in recent months. She was unemployed at the time. And the last time anyone saw her alive was around 1 a.m. that same morning, about 10 miles away, near the intersection of Franklin Street and South 6th Street in downtown Reading. What she was doing there at that hour and who she was with, nobody could answer. Pennsylvania State Police responded to the scene. They processed the area. They collected biological evidence from Anna's clothing and her body. The physical examination made clear she had not been killed where she was found. She'd been murdered somewhere else, then transported and dumped alongside the Unknowingly Trail. Whoever killed her had the time and the means to move her body and leave her where he thought she wouldn't be found quickly. If that motorist hadn't run out of gas on that particular road at that particular time, it might have been days before anyone came across her. Investigators ran the DNA evidence they'd collected. They got a profile, male, unknown. They checked it against every database available to them at the time. Nothing came back. The profile didn't match anyone. The investigation had no suspect and no workable leads. The case drew local attention. The Reading Eagle, the area's main newspaper, reported on the murder. Anna Kane's face appeared in the news, but the coverage wasn't especially kind. Some outlets focused on her background, her criminal record, minor charges for prostitution, and small thefts. The framing, as her daughter would later describe it, was that of a slain prostitute who somehow deserved what happened to her. It was a narrative that reduced a 26-year-old mother to the worst entries in her file and ignored everything else about who she was. Her daughter, Tamika Reyes, would later say that her mother was a firecracker, very outgoing, not afraid of anything, very honest, blunt, and caring. Tamika was 9 years old when her mother was murdered. She and her 2 brothers were raised by their grandmother after that, and Tamika would say that she thought about her mother every single day for the rest of her life. But in 1988, with no suspect and no public pressure to continue, the investigation stalled. The case went cold. 16 months later, something unexpected happened. In February of 1990, the Reading Eagle ran a new front-page story about the murder, revisiting the case and asking the public for information. A few days after that story ran, the newspaper received a letter. It was signed by a concerned citizen. It contained no return address, and it had, as State Police Trooper Daniel Womer would later describe, numerous intimate details about Anna Kane's murder. Details that only someone who was there, someone who saw the crime or committed it, would know. The detectives on the case read that letter and immediately understood what they were looking at. This wasn't a tip from a neighbor or a speculation from an armchair detective. The person who wrote this letter had killed Anna Kane. They were certain of it. But knowing the letter came from the killer and knowing who the killer was are 2 very different problems. The letter was anonymous. The handwriting didn't match anyone in the system. There was no return address to trace. The concerned citizen had reached out from the dark and pulled back without leaving a name. But he did leave something. He left his DNA. When you seal an envelope by licking it, your saliva transfers to the adhesive, and saliva contains DNA. In 1990, investigators tested the envelope. They confirmed that the DNA in the saliva on that envelope matched the male DNA profile found on Anna Kane's clothing. The same man who had killed her had written a letter to the newspaper about it, sealed it with his tongue, and mailed it in. Think about the psychology of that for a second. 16 months have passed since the murder. The case has gone cold. The newspaper runs a front-page story, a public plea for help, and the man who committed the murder reads it and decides to respond. He sits down and writes a letter about it. He includes details only the killer would know. He signs it "Concerned Citizen," and then he licks the envelope shut and drops it in a mailbox. Was it arrogance? Guilt? A compulsion he couldn't control? Whatever it was, he sealed his own DNA inside that letter. He just didn't know anyone would ever be able to read it, and for 32 years, nobody could. The DNA sat in evidence. The envelope sat in evidence. Investigators knew the letter writer was the killer. They had a biological profile that connected the clothing evidence to the letter evidence. They had 2 independent DNA samples that matched each other, but they could not attach a name to either one. The profile was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. No match. It was resubmitted as the database expanded over the years. Still nothing. Year after year, the system checked every new entry against Anna Kane's killer's DNA, and year after year, the answer was silence. Whoever this man was, his DNA wasn't in any criminal database in the country. He had never been arrested for a qualifying offense. He had never been required to give a sample. As far as the system was concerned, he didn't exist. In 2022, Pennsylvania State Police turned to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy. Parabon had already helped crack dozens of cold cases across the country using the same approach. Take the unknown DNA, upload it to a public genealogy database, find relatives, and build a family tree until you identify the source. The technology that had caught the Golden State Killer in 2018 was now standard practice for cold case units nationwide. Parabon ran the profile. The genealogy team built the tree, and the tree pointed to a man named Scott Grimm. Grimm was from Hamburg, Pennsylvania, a small borough about 5 miles from where Anna Kane's body had been found. In 1988, when Anna was murdered, Grimm was 26 years old, the same age as his victim. He had lived in the area his entire life. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't someone from out of state. He was a local man who killed a local woman, dumped her body 5 miles from his own home, and then watched the investigation from behind his own front door. But there was a problem. Scott Grimm had died in 2018. Natural causes. He was 58 years old. He'd lived 30 more years after the murder. He'd grown old. He'd had a life. He'd been dead for 4 years by the time investigators landed on his name. So they couldn't interview him. They couldn't arrest him. They couldn't put him in front of a jury. But they could do one thing. They could test his DNA directly. Trooper Wummer and his team obtained a direct biological sample from Grimm, though they didn't publicly explain how, whether it was from a medical record, an exhumation, or something else. They tested that sample against the DNA on Anna Kane's clothing and the DNA on the Reading Eagle envelope. Every sample matched. Scott Grimm had killed Anna Kane, and Scott Grimm had written the letter about it. And then the investigation turned up something that made the case even more disturbing. In 2002, 14 years after the murder, Scott Grimm had been arrested by Exeter Township Police on a harassment charge. The charge involved sending anonymous letters to a former business partner. Similar anonymous letters, the same behavior, the same compulsion. The police had collected DNA from those envelopes too. When investigators went back and compared everything, the DNA from the 2002 harassment envelopes matched the DNA from the 1990 Reading Eagle envelope and the DNA from Anna Kane's clothing. Every sample, from 3 different sources spanning 14 years, pointed to the same man. Scott Grimm had never stopped writing anonymous letters. He couldn't help himself. And each time he did it, he sealed his identity inside the envelope. Berks County District Attorney John Adams announced the case as solved on August 18, 2022, during a press conference at the Pennsylvania State Police Troop L headquarters in Reading. He acknowledged that while Grimm would never face justice, the identification brought something meaningful to the family. Trooper Wummer said it plainly. "I know in some respects, the fact that he is deceased, he will never face justice as we all would have hoped for this homicide. But we solved it. We gave some closure to the family." For Tamika Reyes, who had been 9 years old when a stranger took her mother and left her in the woods, the news was complicated. She told CNN that she was relieved investigators had finally named the man who killed her mother. But she was upset that Grimm had died peacefully in 2018 of natural causes at the age of 58, never having been arrested, never having been questioned, never having spent a single day in a courtroom for what he did. He lived a full life and died on his own terms. Anna Kane got 26 years and a ditch. Tamika also said something that deserves to be heard, because it pushes back against every story that reduced her mother to a criminal record. She said, "No child should ever have to grow up without a mother. She wasn't what they said she was. She was loving. She was caring. She was funny and fierce, and she was mine." That's the detail the 1988 news coverage left out. The daughter, the 9-year-old girl who lost her mother and spent 34 years waiting for a name. While the newspapers wrote about a slain woman with a record, a little girl was growing up without the person who raised her, and the man who took that person away was writing letters to the paper about it, licking envelopes and mailing his own DNA to the police without even knowing it. Scott Grimm sealed his guilt inside an envelope in 1990. It took 32 years for the science to open it. He died before anyone could make him answer for what was inside. But the answer exists now. Anna Kane's children have it. And for the first time in 34 years, the last word on their mother's life belongs to them and not to the man who ended it. Case 4. Joette Marie Smith. In the weeks before she died, Joette Smith started doing something her friends couldn't explain. She began giving things away, keepsakes, personal items, things she'd held on to for years. She called friends she hadn't spoken to in a long time. People she'd drifted from, just to say hello and tell them she cared about them. When they asked why, she didn't have a clear answer. She just said she felt like her time was running short. Nobody took it literally. Joette was 33 years old. She was healthy. She ran a restaurant. She had a life that, by all outward appearances, was going well. People assumed she was going through a reflective phase, maybe working through something personal. They didn't treat it as a warning. And then, on the morning of March 29, 1983, her body was found floating in the San Lorenzo River near Ben Lomond, California, caught on a tree limb about 30 miles southwest of San Jose. She had been murdered, and the premonition nobody took seriously turned out to be real. Joette Marie Smith grew up in a Polish Catholic family in Nebraska. She was one of those people who filled a room with energy. Her sisters described her as the fun one, hospitable, happy, full of vigor. She moved to the Santa Cruz area about 10 years before her death and fell in love with the community. She opened a small restaurant called Buffalo Gals in Ben Lomond, a mountain town in the redwoods above Santa Cruz. The restaurant served organic food before organic food was a movement. Her sister later called it ahead of its time. Joette cooked for locals, hosted gatherings, and turned that small place into something people remembered. She was the kind of person you wanted to be around. Her sister Annette would later say she wished Joette had lived long enough to be on the Food Network, because that's the kind of talent and warmth she brought to everything she did. On the evening of Sunday, March 27, 1983, Joette had a quiet night at home with her roommate, Rachel Devereaux. They made popcorn and watched The Thornbirds, the television miniseries that was dominating ratings that spring. After the show, Joette went out. She headed to Henfling's Tavern, a local bar in Ben Lomond, to socialize. She was last seen leaving Henfling's at 11:50 p.m. After that, nobody saw her alive again. 2 days later, on the morning of March 29th, her body was found in the San Lorenzo River, caught on a tree limb in the water near Ben Lomond. And the condition of the scene told a story that went far beyond drowning. Joette's body was found wearing almost nothing. A strand of pearls, one nylon stocking on her leg, a single black boot. That was it. Her clothes, the rest of them, were found scattered on the riverbank about a quarter mile upstream from where her body was recovered. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been murdered. And whoever killed her had stripped her and dumped her in the river, either hoping the water would carry her away or not caring whether it did. The Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation. Ben Lomond is a small community in the Santa Cruz Mountains, the kind of town where people recognize each other at the post office and the general store. A murder like this sent a shock through the whole area. People were terrified. Women stopped going out alone at night, and everyone wanted to know who had done this to the woman who ran the restaurant on the main road, the woman everyone liked. Detectives started with the people closest to Joette. They looked at men she'd dated. One early suspect was a man named Bruce, who had been the last customer at the bar that night and had briefly dated Joette. When investigators brought him in, they noticed bruises on his face, which he said came from a bar fight. A bloody shirt was found at his home. But when his DNA was tested against the evidence from the crime scene, it didn't match. He was ruled out. Another man, identified only as Mark, also came under suspicion. Mark had dated Joette previously and seemed to know details about the crime that hadn't been made public, things like the cause of death, the sexual assault, and what she'd been wearing. That kind of knowledge in the early days of an investigation usually points to involvement. But Mark had an alibi from his girlfriend, and with no physical evidence tying him to the scene, that lead died too. The case went cold. For 5 years, investigators had no viable suspect. The community in Ben Lomond remained on edge. People locked their doors, women in town were afraid, and Joette's family waited. Then, in 1988, a break came from an unexpected place. An inmate from another state contacted Santa Cruz County detectives. He told them about a man named Eric David Drummond, who had been working as a janitor at a bar near the area where Joette was killed around the time of the murder. The tip was specific enough to investigate. Detectives looked into Drummond and found something that immediately drew their attention. Drummond had gone to Joette's restaurant Buffalo Gals a few days before she was killed. He asked her out on a date. According to some accounts, Joette told him she'd think about it. According to others, she turned him down. Either way, after Joette was murdered, Drummond abruptly left California. He didn't give notice. He didn't explain. He was just gone. When investigators dug into Drummond's background, they found an extensive history of violence. Later in 1983, just months after Joette's murder, Drummond was convicted of attempted homicide and assault in Redding, California, about 300 miles north. He served 16 months. Then, in 1988, he was convicted again, this time for a violent assault on a family and car theft in Nevada. He served 4 years. He also had sexual assault convictions in both California and Nevada. This was a man with a documented pattern of violence against women, a pattern that stretched from before Joette's death well into the following decade. But in 1988, the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office had a problem. Everything they had on Drummond was circumstantial: the rejected date, the sudden departure, the violent record. All of it pointed in his direction, but none of it was physical evidence. None of it put him at the crime scene. Without forensic proof, they couldn't bring charges, and without charges, they couldn't hold him. The case went cold again, this time with a name attached to it, but no way to prove it. For 34 more years, Eric Drummond lived his life. He moved between California and Nevada. He cycled through the criminal justice system on other charges. He grew older. He settled into a routine. And the clothing Joette Smith was wearing the night she was murdered sat in an evidence locker in Santa Cruz County, untested. That's the part of this case that's hardest to reconcile. The DNA was there the entire time. It was on her clothing. It had been collected in 1983 and preserved as evidence, but it was never tested. Not in the 90s when DNA testing became standard in criminal investigations. Not in the 2000s when cold case units across the country started revisiting old evidence. Not when genetic genealogy blew the field open in 2018. For 39 years, the answer to Joette Smith's murder sat in a box in an evidence room, and nobody opened it. The suspect had a name. The evidence had a profile waiting to be read, and the two sat in separate files in separate buildings, 5 years apart, for more than 3 decades. In 2022, the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office reopened the case. This time, they sent Joette's clothing to a lab for DNA analysis using technology that hadn't existed in 1983. The lab developed a male DNA profile from the evidence. They ran it, and it didn't match anyone in CODIS. But investigators already had a suspect in mind. They already had a name that had been sitting in the file for 34 years. California authorities contacted law enforcement in Washoe County, Nevada, where Drummond was living at the time. In August 2022, investigators asked Drummond for a voluntary DNA sample. And then the story takes its final strangest turn. He agreed. He gave the swab willingly. He handed over the one thing that could connect him to a 39-year-old murder, and he did it without a fight. The swab matched the DNA found on Joette's clothing. Now investigators had what they'd needed since 1988. Physical evidence, a DNA match. Enough to seek an arrest warrant for the murder of Joette Marie Smith. But while the final investigative steps were being taken and the warrant was being prepared, Eric David Drummond killed himself. He was found dead in the hills of Sierra County. He was 64 years old. He had lived 39 years after the murder. He had been identified as a suspect for 34 of those years. And in the end, when the evidence finally closed the gap between what police believed and what they could prove, he chose to die rather than face it. The Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office made the announcement in September 2022. Lieutenant Patrick Dimmock said that while Drummond would never face criminal charges or a jury of his peers, the Sheriff's Office was confident the evidence would have supported a conviction for the murder of Joette Smith. Her sister Yvette took the news with a kind of weary grace. She said Drummond's death was a little bit of a letdown, but she didn't feel like they didn't get justice. The DNA was a match, and that was closure. Her sister Annette said Joette was the fun one. She wished more people could have gotten to know her. She wished Joette had lived long enough to be on the Food Network. And I keep coming back to the premonition, because it doesn't fit any rational explanation. Joette Smith, in the weeks before she died, felt something. She couldn't name it. She couldn't explain it. But she acted on it. She gave away the things she treasured. She picked up the phone and called people she loved and told them so. She did the things people do when they believe, somewhere deep down, that they're running out of time. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the mind picks up on signals the conscious brain can't process. A stranger watching from the bar, a feeling of being followed, something at the edge of awareness that never becomes a thought but drives behavior anyway. Whatever it was, she knew, not the details, not the name, but the shape of what was coming. The night before it happened, Joette Smith sat on a couch, ate popcorn with her roommate, and watched a television show about doomed love and impossible choices. The next night she walked into a bar and never came home. And the man who killed her gave his DNA willingly 39 years later, then walked into the hills and made sure nobody could ask him why. Some answers come too late, and some questions were never going to have answers at all. Case 5. Laura Kempton. On the morning of September 28, 1981, a Portsmouth, New Hampshire police officer walked up to an apartment on Chapel Street to serve a court summons. It was a minor thing, parking meter violations, the kind of errand that fills the bottom of a patrol shift. He knocked on the door. No answer. He tried again. Nothing. The door was damaged. It had been forced open, and when the officer stepped inside, he found 23-year-old Laura Kempton dead on the floor of her apartment. An electrical cord was tied around her ankles. A phone cord was wrapped around her neck and shoulder area. There was blood pooled beneath her head on the rug. And the autopsy that followed would confirm what the scene already made horrifyingly clear. Laura Kempton had suffered massive trauma to the left side of her head, consistent with being struck by a heavy, blunt object. Investigators believed the weapon was a wine bottle. She had been sexually assaulted, and she'd been killed in the early morning hours of that same day, just hours before the officer arrived. The cruel randomness of how her body was found is hard to get past. Laura Kempton didn't have a concerned neighbor who heard something wrong. She didn't have a friend who came looking when she didn't show up. She was found because she owed money on parking meters. A bureaucratic errand, the kind of thing you'd pay off and forget about, put a police officer at her door on the one morning he needed to be there. If that summons had been issued a day later or assigned to a different shift, Laura might have gone undiscovered for much longer. Laura was a student at the Portsmouth Beauty School. She was also working 2 other jobs, one at a gift shop on Market Street called Macro Polo, and another at an ice cream parlor. She was 23, trying to build a career, and by all accounts an outgoing free spirit with a big personality and a love for new wave fashion. She didn't have a steady boyfriend, but she was social. She enjoyed going out. She liked to dance. The night before her death, on September 27th, Laura went to the Riverside Club in Portsmouth with a man she'd been casually dating. They danced, had a good time, and went back to her apartment around 1:30 a.m. When they arrived, Laura unlocked the door, let them both in, and relocked it behind them. The man left later that morning. Laura was alive and fine when he left. Whatever happened to her happened after that, in the window between his departure and the officer's arrival. The door had been broken in from the outside. This wasn't a guest who turned violent. Someone forced their way into Laura Kempton's apartment after she was alone, attacked her, sexually assaulted her, and beat her to death. The attack was savage and fast, and the killer left behind a trail of evidence that, in 1981, was invisible but would eventually become the key to everything. Investigators collected DNA from multiple sources in that apartment, a cigarette butt left behind by the intruder, a pillowcase, biological evidence from Laura's body. All of it yielded the same male DNA profile. The killer had smoked a cigarette in her apartment either before or after the attack and left the butt sitting there. He'd touched surfaces. He'd left traces everywhere. In a modern investigation, that evidence would have produced a name within weeks. In 1981, DNA profiling didn't exist yet. The cigarette butt went into an evidence bag, and the evidence bag went into storage. Over the next 4 decades, Portsmouth police pursued hundreds of leads and investigated dozens of potential suspects. Every boyfriend, every acquaintance, every person with a criminal record in the area was looked at. None of them matched. The DNA profile from the cigarette butt and the other evidence sat in the case file, a genetic fingerprint with no name attached to it. As DNA databases expanded through the 90s and 2000s, investigators submitted the profile again and again, hoping for a hit. It never came. The investigation cycled through multiple generations of detectives, each one picking up the file, working the leads they could and handing it off when they ran out of road. Portsmouth is a small city. The murder of a young woman in her own apartment was the kind of case that stayed in the department's memory even as the people working it changed. And then there was the shadow case. Almost exactly 1 year after Laura's murder, on October 19, 1982, a second student from the Portsmouth Beauty School was found murdered in her apartment. Her name was Tammy Little. She was 20 years old. The cause of death was the same, massive head injuries. The circumstances were eerily similar. 2 beauty school students, 2 apartment break-ins, 2 savage beatings. In the same small city, barely a year apart, investigators naturally asked whether the same person had killed both women. The similarities were hard to ignore, but the police also knew that similarity isn't proof. For decades, the 2 cases existed in a kind of uneasy parallel, connected in the public imagination, but never officially linked by evidence. Tammy Little's case remains unsolved to this day. The first lead detective assigned to Laura Kempton's murder was William Mortimer, a member of the Portsmouth Police Commission. Mortimer worked the case hard, chased every lead, and never stopped believing there was an answer. At his retirement party in 2002, 21 years after the murder, he told colleagues he was confident the case would eventually be solved. He said he had faith in the advances happening in forensic science, that the technology was catching up to the evidence his team had preserved. Mortimer died in 2019 at the age of 95. He never got to see it happen. In 2021, investigators in Portsmouth's Cold Case Division began discussing a relatively new tool, forensic genetic genealogy using whole genome sequencing. The technique had exploded into public awareness in 2018 with the arrest of the Golden State Killer, and by 2021, it was being used by cold case units across the country. The approach takes degraded or old DNA evidence, sequences the entire genome, and uploads it to a public genealogy database to search for relatives who share enough genetic markers to build a family tree. In May 2022, the team submitted the DNA profile from Laura's apartment to a third-party public genetic genealogy database. They got 2 hits, not to the killer himself, but to 2 of his relatives. From there, they built the family tree, and the tree led to a man named Ronnie James Lee. Lee was 21 years old at the time of Laura Kempton's murder. He'd served in the Army before being discharged. He was living and working in the Portsmouth area in 1981. He had a criminal record that, when investigators pulled it, read like a road map pointing straight to Chapel Street. In the early 1980s, after Laura's murder, Ronnie Lee was arrested multiple times in the Portsmouth area. He was charged with burglaries. He was charged with a sexual assault against another woman. He had a documented pattern of breaking into apartments and committing crimes of opportunity against women living alone. He'd been on Portsmouth police radar for years, just not in connection with Laura Kempton's case. A 1983 booking photo shows a young man with a hard stare who could have been sitting in an interrogation room answering questions about Chapel Street. Instead, he was being processed for other crimes while the Kempton file sat in a different drawer. And that's where the frustration hits hardest. Lee was living and offending in the exact same small city where Laura was killed, during the exact same years, committing the exact same type of crime. He was breaking into apartments, he was assaulting women, he was right there. But nobody connected the dots. His name never came up in the Kempton investigation. The evidence that would have matched him sat in storage while he walked the same streets the detectives were canvassing. In June 2022, investigators confirmed that Lee's DNA profile matched multiple samples taken from Laura's apartment, including the cigarette butt, the pillowcase, and the biological evidence. The match was conclusive. The Attorney General's report would later state that the evidence established beyond a reasonable doubt that Ronnie James Lee committed first-degree murder. But Lee wouldn't face charges. He died on February 9, 2005 at the age of 45 from acute cocaine intoxication. He'd been dead for 17 years by the time investigators said his name. Attorney General John Formella told reporters that if Lee were still alive, his office would have charged him with first-degree murder for knowingly causing Laura Kempton's death in connection with sexual assault. There was no indication that Lee knew Laura or had any prior connection to her. Assistant Attorney General Rachel Harrington said it plainly. This was a crime of opportunity, a calculated break-in that was sexually motivated. Lee chose that apartment because it was accessible. He chose Laura because she was alone. On July 20, 2023, 42 years after a police officer knocked on Laura Kempton's door with a parking ticket and found a murder scene, the New Hampshire Attorney General held a press conference in Portsmouth to announce the case was solved. Portsmouth Police Chief Mark Newport stood beside him. Laura's family submitted a statement expressing their gratitude to the generations of officers who had kept the case alive. They specifically named retired Captain John Paraki and his team, past and present, for working tirelessly on Laura's case. Their extraordinary efforts, the family said, led to this important moment. Formella said he hoped the announcement would send a message to anyone affected by a cold case in New Hampshire, that they will never stop working these cases, that they will never forget about these victims, and that they will never stop looking for new leads. He also addressed the Tammy Little case directly. The investigation into the second beauty school student's murder remains open. Investigators said they found no evidence linking Ronnie Lee to Tammy's death. Whether that means he wasn't involved or that the evidence simply didn't survive is a question nobody can answer yet. The two cases, linked for decades in the public's mind, now stand separated by a name. One is solved, one is not. And somewhere in the middle of all of it is a cigarette butt. A small, disposable thing that a killer left behind in a dead woman's apartment in 1981, probably without thinking twice about it. He smoked it, dropped it, and walked out. The lead detective who first bagged that cigarette butt believed it would matter someday. He was right. He just didn't live long enough to see it. Laura Kempton was 23 years old. She was building a life in a small New England city, working 3 jobs, learning a trade, going out dancing on Saturday nights. And a man broke down her door and took all of it from her. The only thing he left behind was his DNA, sealed inside a cigarette filter, waiting 42 years for science to read it. The officer who came to serve parking tickets found the answer the same morning it happened. He just didn't know what he was looking at. Nobody did. Not yet. Case 6. Charles and Catherine Romer. April 8, 1980, a Tuesday evening in Brunswick, Georgia. A retired oil executive and his wife pull their 1979 Lincoln Continental off Interstate 95 at exit 36, check into a Holiday Inn, and carry a few bags to their room. They're on the long drive home from their winter apartment in Florida to their house on Popham Road in Scarsdale, a wealthy suburb of New York City. It's a drive they've made every spring for years. Stop in Georgia on the way up, rest for the night, continue north in the morning. Charles Romer was 73 years old. He had spent his career as an executive at the Sinclair Oil Corporation, one of America's major petroleum companies. His wife, Catherine, was 77. Between them, they had built a comfortable retirement, the kind that moves with the seasons, winters in Florida, summers in New York. Catherine was wearing approximately $81,000 worth of jewelry when they checked in that night. The next morning, hotel employees noticed something unusual. The Romers' bed had not been slept in. Their bags were in the room, but the couple was gone. Their car was gone. Not a single person had seen them leave, and the staff couldn't account for when they'd last been in the building. The hotel reported them missing almost immediately, and what followed was, in the words of one officer, the biggest all-out search in the history of southern Georgia. Law enforcement canvassed the area around the hotel. They searched the interstate. They searched the side roads. They searched the woods and the marshland along the coast. Divers went into nearby bodies of water. Helicopters flew patterns over the countryside. Nothing. The Romers had vanished. Their Lincoln Continental had vanished with them, and not a single piece of physical evidence was found to explain where they went. For the investigators and for the family, one theory dominated from the beginning. With $81,000 in jewelry, a luxury car, and 2 elderly people traveling alone through the rural South, the assumption was foul play. Somebody had followed them. Somebody had robbed them. Somebody had killed them and disposed of the car. The former hotel clerk, Andy Mavramat, put it simply years later. We just all figured, with all the money they had, somebody followed them and robbed them. That theory became the lens through which everything was viewed. Every search, every investigation, every interview operated under the assumption that the Romers were the victims of a violent crime. It shaped the questions detectives asked and the places they looked, and it may be the single biggest reason the case went unsolved for 44 years. Because the Romers weren't robbed, they weren't murdered, and the answer was closer than anyone ever thought to look. But nobody knew that in 1980, and as the weeks stretched into months and the months into years, the case cooled into one of those unsolvable mysteries that communities carry around like a weight. In Scarsdale, people at the senior center near the Romer's home still talked about it decades later. Everyone had a theory. Everyone remembered the couple, and nobody could make peace with the fact that two people could simply evaporate between checking into a hotel and sunrise. The family carried it hardest. Charles and Kaitlyn had children from previous marriages. Charles had 2 sons, Charles Jr. and Jim. Kaitlyn had a son named Frank Heller from her first marriage to the president of Raymond and Heller, a carpet manufacturing company. These were the generation that inherited the mystery. Charles Jr. spent years traveling to Georgia, working with investigators, chasing leads, doing everything a son does when his parents disappear and nobody can tell him why. And one by one, that generation died without answers. Charles Romer Jr., Jim Romer, Frank Heller. All 3 passed away before the mystery was solved. They spent their lives wondering whether their parents suffered, whether they were afraid, whether it was violent. They carried that uncertainty to their own graves. The next generation, 9 granddaughters, all grew up under the shadow of the same question. Christine Seaman Heller, one of Kaitlyn's granddaughters, said, "She never went a single day without worrying about what happened. She said it was something you held with you every single day of your life. The not knowing, the imagining, the possibility that it ended horribly." For 44 years, the Romer family lived with that weight. Psychics were consulted, private investigators were hired, tips came in and led nowhere. The case was revisited periodically by new detectives, but never moved forward. At some point, most of the family accepted that they would never know, that it would simply be a question mark at the center of their family history forever. And then, in November 2024, a volunteer dive team from Florida changed everything. Sunshine State Sonar is a small organization that does exactly what its name suggests. They use sonar technology to search bodies of water for submerged vehicles, usually in connection with missing persons cases. They work with law enforcement, they work with families, and they go to the places nobody else has looked, or the places everyone looked but the technology of the time couldn't see. Their method is straightforward but remarkably effective. They map the waterways near a missing person's last known location, and then they scan them systematically, one by one, starting from the point the person was last seen and working outward. As Shelley McKinney from the team described it, "We make our maps, and one by one, we start from where they were last seen and kind of work our way out." When the team decided to investigate the Romer disappearance, they started exactly where the couple was last confirmed alive, the Holiday Inn at exit 36 in Brunswick. And they didn't have to work very far out. On November 22, 2024, using sonar equipment, the team located a submerged vehicle in a retention pond directly behind the hotel. The pond sat just off the parking area, close to the building. When they identified the outline on their screens, the shape matched a large American sedan from the late 70s. Divers went down. They found the rusted, deteriorated shell of a 1979 Lincoln Continental. Inside the car, they found a human bone, and they found something else. The headrests in the vehicle were monogrammed. The initials on them belonged to Charles and Kaitlyn Romer. Kim Romer, one of the couple's granddaughters, received a phone call from a detective that same day. He told her about the bone and the initials. He told her the car was definitely theirs. After 44 years of silence, a phone rang and everything changed. The car had been in that pond for 44 years. It was roughly 50 feet from the hotel lobby. Glynn County Police and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation took over the site. They brought in heavy equipment and drained the pond entirely. They searched the mud and the sediment for additional remains. The car was recovered Tuesday night, rusted through, covered in decades of corrosion and bacterial growth, barely recognizable as a vehicle. Special equipment was needed just to lift it from the muck. Now, here is the detail that makes this case different from every other story in this video. There was no killer. There was no crime. The leading theory, the one that investigators now believe explains what happened, is that the Romers checked into their room, walked back to their car for some reason, and accidentally put the Lincoln Continental in reverse instead of drive. The car rolled backward into the retention pond. In the dark, in an unfamiliar parking lot, with the kind of heavy American sedan that moves fast once it starts rolling, they went into the water before they could react. Reports indicate that divers actually searched the area in 1980, in the weeks after the disappearance. But the water was dark and murky, a blackwater pond in coastal Georgia where visibility is measured in inches. The car, once it sank, would have settled into the mud at the bottom. Without modern sonar, the divers were essentially searching blind. They missed it. And for 44 years, every time someone drove past that hotel, the roamers were right there under the water waiting. Consider what that means for the family. For 44 years, they imagined the worst. They assumed their grandparents were targeted by criminals, robbed for their jewelry, killed and disposed of somewhere along the interstate. They lived with visions of violence, of fear, of their grandparents' last moments being ones of terror and pain. 3 of their children died carrying that belief. And the truth was a parking lot. A car in reverse, a dark pond, a terrible accident that took less than a minute. That doesn't make it less tragic, but it changes the nature of the grief entirely. Christine Seaman Heller said it herself when the possibility of an accident first emerged. It would be so wonderful to find out. Just have some peace. Maybe it wasn't a horrible ending. Maybe it was just an accident. On November 28, 2024, the Romer family issued a statement confirming that the remains found in the vehicle belonged to Charles and Kaitlyn. The statement read, "In part, we are deeply saddened and equally relieved that our grandparents Charles and Kaitlyn Romer's 44-year mystery disappearance has been solved. While this discovery brings closure, it still has been very emotional. Sadly, Charles Romer Jr., Jim Romer, and Frank Heller are not with us to share this momentous turn of events and to know their parents will finally be laid to rest in peace." That last sentence is the one that stays with you. The 3 people who spent their lives searching for answers didn't live to hear them. The sons who drove to Georgia year after year, who hired investigators and called tip lines and never stopped asking questions, they died without knowing that their parents were 50 feet from where they checked in. The answer was always there. It was always reachable. It just took 44 years and a sonar team from Florida to find it. The Romer case is different from the others in this video. There's no villain, there's no arrest, there's no DNA match or confession, there's just a retention pond behind a hotel and a car that nobody found for 4 decades. But the grief was the same. The decades of not knowing were the same. And the relief, bittersweet and incomplete, was the same too. Charles and Kaitlyn Romer left Florida on a spring day in 1980, heading home to New York the way they always did. They stopped for the night in Brunswick, Georgia, because that's what you do on a 900-mile drive when you're in your 70s. They checked into a Holiday Inn. They put their bags down. And somewhere between that room and the next morning, they ended up in the water behind the building, in a car nobody would find until their grandchildren were old enough to have grandchildren of their own. They were never robbed. They were never followed. They were never the victims of the crime everyone spent 44 years believing in. They were 2 people who had an accident in a parking lot, in the dark, far from home. And the pond kept them hidden until the day someone brought the right equipment and looked in the right place. Case 7. Jerimiah. Jerry Watkins. Every other case in this video was solved by science, DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, sonar technology, forensic breakthroughs that didn't exist when the crime was committed. This one wasn't solved by any of that. This case was solved by a man who opened a 37-year-old file, read the original interviews, and noticed something that every detective before him had missed. November 12, 1985. Terra Alta, West Virginia. A small town in Preston County, up near the Maryland border, population barely over 1,000. The kind of place where the main street has 1 traffic light and everyone knows everyone by their first name. 1 week earlier, a torrential flood had swept through the region, causing devastation across the state, Roads were washed out, communities were in recovery mode, and in the middle of all of that chaos, searchers found the body of a 13-year-old boy. His name was Jerimiah Watkins. Everyone called him Jerry. He'd been reported missing a few days before his body was discovered. The search had been complicated by the flood damage, the disrupted roads, the general confusion of a community trying to dig out from under a natural disaster. When they found him, he was in a shallow hole near the railroad tracks on the outskirts of town. He'd been placed there, partially covered, like someone had tried to hide him quickly and without much planning. The autopsy told a violent story. Jerry had suffered a brain bleed from an apparent blow to the head, something heavy enough to cause internal bleeding. But that wasn't what killed him. The cause of death was a stab wound to the back. Somebody had hit this boy in the head and then stabbed him, and then dragged his body to the tracks and put him in a hole. Jerry was 13 years old. He was a kid in a small town. He rode bikes. He hung around with other kids in the neighborhood. He wasn't mixed up in anything dangerous. He wasn't running with the wrong crowd. He was a child, and somebody killed him and buried him near the railroad tracks while the rest of the town was cleaning up from a flood. The Preston County Sheriff's Office investigated. They interviewed people in the neighborhood. They took statements from anyone who might have seen Jerry in the days before his disappearance. They looked at everyone in Jerry's orbit and everyone who lived near the railroad tracks. In a town the size of Terra Alta, that's a short list. Everybody is a neighbor, everybody is a potential witness, and everybody is also a potential suspect. Somewhere in that initial round of interviews, they talked to a young man named David Monroe Adams. Adams was 18 years old at the time. He lived in Terra Alta. In a town with barely 1,000 people, he would have been a familiar face, someone Jerry almost certainly knew by sight, if not by name. Adams gave a statement to investigators in 1985, and whatever he said, it apparently didn't raise enough flags to pursue him further. His statement went into the file alongside dozens of others, and the investigation moved on. But it didn't move on to anything productive. The case went cold. It stayed cold through the rest of the 80s. It stayed cold through the 90s. It stayed cold through the 2000s. Different officers reviewed it over the years. The West Virginia State Police and the Monongalia County Sheriff's Department both assisted at various points. In 2004, nearly 20 years after the murder, a state police sergeant named Danny Swiger told the Preston County Journal that it was one case he would really like to see solved. But wanting a case solved and having the tools to solve it are different things, and by 2004, there was no new evidence, no new witnesses, and no new reason to believe the original investigation had missed something critical. The file went back into the drawer. Jerry's family lived with the weight of it for decades. His sister, Jamie Cole, was only a year old when Jerry was killed. She grew up knowing her brother only through photographs and the stories her mother told her. She never got to know him as a person. She just knew that he was gone, that somebody had taken him, and that nobody could tell her who or why. As the years passed, Cole said she'd started to accept that the case would never be solved. In the last 5 or 6 years, she said, she'd grown to live with the idea that she would never have answers, that it was just going to be one of those open wounds that her family carried forever. She made her peace with it, or as close to peace as a person can get when their brother was murdered and nobody was ever held responsible. And then, in early February 2023, Captain T.N. Tichnell of the Preston County Sheriff's Office pulled Jerry Watkins's case file off the shelf. What happened next is the whole reason this case matters, because there's no fancy technology behind it. No lab, no database, no genealogy team building family trees from DNA fragments. Captain Tichnell sat down and did something that sounds simple, but apparently nobody had done thoroughly enough in 37 years. He read the original statements, all of them, line by line, and he compared what different people had said in 1985 to what the physical evidence showed and to what other witnesses had described. When he got to the statements made by David Monroe Adams, the 18-year-old who'd been interviewed during the initial investigation, Tichnell noticed something. The statements had inconsistencies, details that didn't line up, things Adams had said that contradicted other parts of the record. The captain didn't specify publicly what those inconsistencies were. and the sheriff's office has been careful about releasing details of the investigation. But whatever Tishnell found in those old pages was enough to pull the thread. Within days, not weeks, not months, days, law enforcement brought David Adams in for new interviews. Adams was now 56 years old, living in Westover, West Virginia, about 30 miles northwest of Terra Alta. He hadn't been living under a fake name. He hadn't fled the state. He'd been right there in West Virginia for 37 years, living a life, getting older, carrying whatever he carried from that day near the railroad tracks. The interviews were conducted under oath. Adams was now sitting across a table from law enforcement for the first time since 1985, answering questions about the same boy in the same county 37 years later. And according to court documents in the sheriff's office statement, he eventually confessed. He told investigators that it started with an argument, a stolen bicycle, a dispute between an 18-year-old and a 13-year-old over a bike that one of them had taken from the other. The kind of petty conflict that happens in every small town, between every pair of teenagers, every day of the year. It should have ended with a shouting match or a shove. It should have ended with a parent getting involved or somebody walking away mad. Instead, Adams told police, the argument escalated at his residence. He struck Jerry in the face. Then he took the boy into a shed on the property. And in that shed, he stabbed Jerry Watkins in the back. After that, he dragged the boy's body from the shed to the shallow hole near the railroad tracks where searchers would find him days later in the aftermath of a flood that had the whole county looking in every direction but that one. A stolen bicycle. A 13-year-old boy dead because of a stolen bicycle. That's the motive that sat buried in a cold case file for 37 years. Not a gang hit, not a predator, not some dark conspiracy that required advanced forensic science to untangle. An 18-year-old got into a fight with a kid over a bike, lost control, and killed him. And then he sat through a police interview, gave a statement that didn't quite add up, and walked out the door. He moved to Westover, about 30 miles away. He lived there for decades. He grew old. And nobody came for him until a captain in a county office decided to read that file one more time. On February 14, 2023, Valentine's Day, the Preston County Sheriff's Office announced that David Monroe Adams had been charged with second-degree murder in the death of Jerimiah Matthew Watkins. He was being held at the North Central Regional Jail on a $1 million bond. The Sheriff's Office said additional charges were anticipated as the investigation continued. Sheriff Paul Pritt was asked why the department had chosen to reopen the case after all this time. His answer was blunt, because it wasn't solved. That was it. No special initiative, no outside pressure, no cold case podcast generating tips. A captain decided to look at an unsolved murder, read the file more carefully than anyone had before, and found what he was looking for. When Jamie Cole, Jerry's sister, got the news, she struggled to describe what she felt. She said she and her mother were both numb. "There's a sense of relief," she said, and then she paused. Well, I don't know if relief is the right word for it. That pause says more than any sentence could. Because what do you call the feeling when someone finally tells you who killed your brother 37 years ago, and the answer is that it was over a bicycle? What do you call it when the entire mechanism of justice, decades of investigators and databases and cold case reviews, turns out to have been unnecessary? When all it took was one person sitting down and reading the file carefully. There's something about this case that separates it from every other story we've covered here. The Watkins case didn't need better technology. It didn't need DNA. It didn't need a family tree traced back to the 1780s or a sonar scan of a body of water. It needed attention. Sustained, careful, skeptical attention applied to a stack of old papers by someone who refused to take the original conclusions at face value. Captain Tishnell read those statements the way a detective is supposed to read them. He compared what was said to what was known. He looked for the gaps. And the gaps led straight to David Adams, who had been sitting in the record the whole time, hidden behind an interview that apparently nobody had scrutinized closely enough. Adams was 18 when he killed Jerry Watkins in a shed over a stolen bicycle. He was 56 when he finally admitted it. In the 37 years between, he lived in the same state. He was reachable. The truth had been sitting in a file drawer the whole time, waiting for someone to read it one more time. Jerry Watkins was 13 years old. He had a sister who was too young to remember him. He had a mother who carried his memory for decades. And his case sat unsolved through every advance in forensic science the country has ever produced, only to be cracked by the oldest tool in law enforcement, someone who read the file and didn't believe what was on the page. Case 8. Sandra DiFelice. In February 2021, a woman picked up the phone and called the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's cold case unit. She identified herself as the daughter of Sandra DiFelice. She said her mother had been murdered in 1980, and she asked a simple question: is there any update on the investigation? She was 3 years old on the night her mother was killed. She'd spent the night at her grandparents' house while Sandra stayed home. When she woke up the next morning, her mother was gone. Not missing. Gone. And for 40 years, that's all she knew. Her mother had been murdered. No one had been arrested or charged. The case was open, somewhere in a file, and nothing was happening. That phone call from a grown woman who had been a toddler on the worst night of her family's life is the reason this case was eventually solved. Without it, there's a real chance Sandra DiFelice's murder would still be sitting in that file, untouched, with the answer literally under her fingernails. Sandra Renee DiFelice was 25 years old when she died. She was originally from Boise, Idaho, and had moved to Las Vegas with a childhood friend. The two of them rented a house together near East Bonanza Road and Maryland Parkway, not far from downtown. Sandra worked as a waitress at Sambo's, a restaurant chain that was all over the country in the late 70s and early 80s. She had a 3-year-old daughter. She was young, she was working, and she was trying to make a life for herself and her child in a city that chews people up and doesn't always spit them back out. On the evening of December 26, 1980, the day after Christmas, Sandra's boyfriend came to the house and found her dead in her bedroom. She had been beaten, she had been sexually assaulted, she had been strangled. Local journalists at the time described it as one of the most savage murders in Las Vegas history. And yet the case received almost no media coverage. A 25-year-old mother killed in her own bed on the day after Christmas, and it barely made the local news. The crime scene told investigators several things. They collected numerous black or dark hairs from Sandra's stomach. Sandra had light hair. The hairs belonged to somebody else, somebody who had been on top of her during the attack. They also collected material from under her fingernails, which suggested she had fought back, scratching her attacker hard enough to take skin and biological material with her. In the days after the murder, Sandra's roommate gave police a piece of information that should have been a red flag from the start. She told investigators that on the morning of December 26th, before she left for work, she found a man standing in the doorway of the bedroom where Sandra was sleeping. His name was Paul Nuttall. He was 21 years old. The roommate knew him casually, but Sandra didn't. When the roommate asked what he was doing there, Nuttall said he had nowhere to go and asked if he could sleep in the house. The roommate told him no because Sandra was home and didn't know him well. She made Nuttall leave with her as she went to work. That same day, Sandra was found dead in the bedroom where Nuttall had been standing hours earlier. Investigators followed up on Nuttall. They found his fingerprint on a drinking glass inside the home. They questioned him. But according to Lieutenant Jason Johansson, who would later lead the cold case investigation, police at the time found an explanation for why that fingerprint was there. Nuttall knew the roommate. He'd been in the house before, possibly more than once. The fingerprint on the glass could be explained by a previous visit. And without DNA technology, without the ability to test the material under Sandra's fingernails or match those dark hairs to a specific person, investigators couldn't build a case strong enough to charge him. Stop and consider what investigators were looking at. Nuttall was in the bedroom doorway that morning. His fingerprint was in the house. The roommate had told police about his behavior. Dark hairs that didn't belong to Sandra were on her body. All of that pointed in one direction. But in 1980, pointing wasn't enough. You needed physical proof that put the suspect's hands on the victim, and the technology to produce that proof from fingernail scrapings or loose hairs simply didn't exist. Nuttall was listed as a person of interest, and then the investigation moved on. And then it stopped. The case went cold. A 25-year-old mother murdered on the day after Christmas, and the file closed with a question mark. For the next 4 decades, Paul Nuttall lived in Las Vegas. He stayed in the same city where he had killed Sandra DiFelice. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't on the run. He was just there, living a quiet, unremarkable life in the Northwest Valley. His criminal record over those 42 years included charges for drug possession and non-payment of child support. Nothing violent, no assaults, no break-ins, no behavior that would have brought him back to the attention of homicide detectives. He aged out of whatever rage had driven him into Sandra's bedroom that morning, or at least he never got caught acting on it again. Meanwhile, Sandra's daughter grew up. She was raised by her grandparents, the same people she'd been staying with on the night her mother was killed. She grew into a woman who knew her mother only through photographs and the things other people told her. She knew the outline of the story. She knew how her mother died. She knew nobody had been held accountable. She knew the case was technically still open, but that nothing was happening. For years, maybe decades, she carried that knowledge quietly. And then at some point in February 2021, she decided to make a phone call. That call landed on the desk of a cold case detective. And that detective did what cold case detectives do when a family member reaches out. He pulled the file. He reviewed the evidence. He looked at what had been tested and what hadn't. And he found something that, in hindsight, is almost impossible to believe. The DNA under Sandra DiFelice's fingernails had never been tested. Let that sit for a second. Sandra fought her killer hard enough to scrape his skin off with her bare hands. The biological evidence was collected at the scene in 1980. It was logged, it was preserved, and for 41 years, nobody tested it. Not when DNA analysis became available in the late 80s, not when CODIS went online in the 90s, not when cold case units across the country started systematically retesting old evidence in the 2000s. For 4 decades, the proof of who killed Sandra DiFelice was sitting under her fingernails in an evidence bag, and it never went to a lab. The detective submitted the fingernail scrapings for testing using modern DNA technology. On October 14, 2022, the forensic laboratory report came back. The DNA under Sandra's fingernails matched a profile in the system. It belonged to Paul Nuttall, the man who had been standing in Sandra's bedroom doorway on the morning she was killed, the man whose fingerprint was on a glass in her kitchen, the man the roommate had to make leave the house before she went to work. He had been right there the entire time, and his DNA had been under Sandra's nails for 42 years, waiting for someone to look. On October 27, 2022, Paul Nuttall was arrested at his home in the Northwest Valley of Las Vegas. He was 64 years old. He was charged with open murder with the use of a deadly weapon, sexual assault with the use of a deadly weapon, and burglary while in possession of a deadly weapon. This wasn't the first time police had approached Nuttall about Sandra DiFelice since the case was reopened. In December 2021, months before the lab results came back, an investigator went to Nuttall's home and obtained a DNA sample from him directly. The investigator asked Nuttall if he wanted to talk about Sandra DiFelice's murder. Nuttall said he didn't know who the investigator was talking about. He gave the sample, and then he waited. For 10 months, he sat in his house in Northwest Las Vegas, knowing that the police had his DNA and were comparing it to evidence from a 42-year-old murder scene. And he did nothing. He didn't run. He didn't hire a lawyer. He just waited. When the arrest finally came, and officers told him why, Nuttall repeated the same line. He didn't know who Sandra DiFelice was. He'd lived in the same city as his victim's grave for 42 years, and he claimed not to recognize her name. At the press conference announcing the arrest, Lieutenant Johansson said something that captured what this moment meant to the investigators who had worked the case. He said, "After Paul Nuttall was taken into custody, my cold case investigators had the pleasure of making the one phone call that every cold case detective wants to make. And that was to call the family member, specifically Sandra DiFelice's daughter, and let her know that there had been a development in the case and that we had arrested the suspect responsible for the murder. Think about the symmetry of that. The daughter made a phone call that reopened the case, and the detective made a phone call that closed it. 2 calls, 41 years apart, bookending a murder that everyone else had forgotten. There's one more detail about this case that I can't leave out, because it captures something about the passage of time that statistics and timelines can't. The house where Sandra DiFelice was murdered, the small rental near East Bonanza Road and Maryland Parkway where she lived with her roommate, and where her 3-year-old daughter slept over at Grandma's the night she was killed. That house still stands. But it's not a house anymore. Today, it serves as the headquarters of the Las Vegas chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The place where a young mother from Boise, Idaho was beaten and strangled in her bed on the day after Christmas in 1980 is now a clubhouse. The bedroom where Paul Nuttall stood in the doorway at dawn, the room where Sandra was found that evening, is inside a building that most people in Las Vegas drive past without a second thought. The location has been completely rewritten, but the evidence that came out of it, the scrapings from under a dead woman's fingernails, outlasted every renovation, every new owner, and every year of silence. Sandra DiFelice was 25 years old. She had a daughter she was raising. She had a roommate who tried to protect her that morning by making a strange man leave. And she fought hard enough in her final moments to tear the answer off her killer's skin. Her body held that answer for 42 years. All it took to read it was one phone call from the little girl she left behind. That little girl is a grown woman now, and she finally knows who took her mother from her on the day after Christmas, 1980. She asked one question in 2021, "Is there any update?" And the answer was under her mother's fingernails the entire time. Case 9, Sheri Jo Elliott. November 16th, 1983. A Wednesday morning in Flint, Michigan. 16-year-old Sheri Jo Elliott walks out of her house at about 6:30 a.m. to catch the bus to Carmen High School. She's new in town. She moved to Flint recently to live with her mother, Joyce, and her stepfather, Robert Schultz, after spending time with her father in Charlotte, a smaller city about 60 miles to the southwest. Sheri is shy. She's smart. She's careful around strangers, the kind of teenager who keeps her guard up, especially in an unfamiliar place. She walks toward the bus stop, and she never arrives. When Sheri didn't come home from school that afternoon, her family reported her missing. Police and community members organized search parties and combed the area around the bus stop, her route from the house, the surrounding neighborhood. They found nothing. Not a single witness who saw her get into a vehicle, no evidence of a struggle on the sidewalk or in the grass, no sign of where she went after leaving her front door. For a girl who was described as cautious and deliberate, it made no sense. She didn't run away. She didn't skip school. She walked toward a bus stop on a cold November morning and vanished somewhere between her door and the curb. Her mother, Joyce Schultz, said something to the Flint Journal during those first terrible days that captures the impossibility of the situation. She said it seemed like her daughter could not just vanish without being seen. Someone, somewhere, had to see her when she was abducted or when she was kept somewhere for 3 days. 3 days. Joyce said 3 days because that's what the autopsy would later confirm. Sheri Jo Elliott did not die on November 16th. She was taken that morning, held somewhere, and kept alive for approximately 72 hours. The autopsy records indicate she was still alive as late as November 19th, the day before her body was found. 3 days in captivity. 3 days where she was somewhere in the area, alive, while police and family searched the streets and neighborhoods and empty lots around Flint. On November 20th, 1983, 4 days after Sheri disappeared, a muskrat trapper making his rounds in Saginaw County found her body in a ditch along a rural road in Blumfield Township. The location was about 35 miles north of Flint in the flat farmland between Saginaw and Bay City. Sheri had been sexually assaulted, she had been shot 4 times, and she had been left on the side of a road in a place where nobody would have any reason to look for a missing Flint teenager. The investigation was intense from the start. Michigan State Police and local law enforcement worked the case aggressively. They interviewed people in Sheri's neighborhood, teachers at her school, anyone who might have seen a vehicle near the bus stop that morning. They looked at men in the area with criminal records. They looked at her family. Her stepfather, Robert Schultz, came under suspicion early on, which is standard in cases involving missing children. Family members were investigated and cleared. Detectives canvassed the 35-mile stretch between Flint and Blumfield Township, trying to figure out why a body would end up that far north. They checked rest stops, farmhouses, and outbuildings along the route, but not a single person could be placed at the scene of the abduction, and no one could be connected to the location where the body was found. The physical evidence from Sheri's body included biological material from her attacker, but in 1983, DNA profiling was still years away from being available to criminal investigators. The evidence was collected and preserved by officers who understood they were holding something important, even if they couldn't yet use it. And then the investigation hit a wall. Within a year, the case was cold. The leads had dried up. The witnesses who might have seen something on that dark November morning either didn't exist or didn't come forward. A 16-year-old girl vanished between her front door and a bus stop, and the only person who knew what happened walked away with the secret. The biological evidence sat in storage, holding an answer that the technology of the time could not read. Over the decades that followed, detectives reopened the case multiple times. Each time they reviewed the evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and looked for new angles. Each time, they came up short. The case became one of those unsolved murders that haunts a department, the file everyone knows about and nobody can close. Officers who worked it early in their careers retired without seeing a resolution. New detectives inherited the case and the frustration that came with it. The folder got thicker with each review, but the answer inside it stayed the same. Unknown. Sheri's aunt, Judy Sika, described what the years of not knowing felt like. She said you just don't know what a terrible thing it is in your mind when they tell you they found her body. That was awful. And the awful didn't end with the discovery. It continued through every year that passed without an arrest. Every birthday Sheri never got to celebrate. Every Christmas the family sat through knowing that the person who took her was still out there, still breathing, still free. In 2023, 40 years after the murder, Michigan State Police assigned the case to their 3rd District Cold Case Unit for a fresh review. This time, they brought in reinforcements from an unexpected place. The MSP partnered with Western Michigan University's Cold Case Program, an academic initiative founded by Dr. Ashlyn Kirsten, where undergraduate students work alongside law enforcement on real unsolved cases. The students go through intensive confidentiality training and are vetted by state police before they're allowed to see any case files. The students were given the Sheri Jo Elliott case file. Decades of investigative material, hundreds of documents, interview transcripts, evidence logs, forensic reports. All of it accumulated over 40 years and stored in boxes that had been opened and closed by generations of detectives. The students' job was to reorganize everything, digitize the records, and make the entire case accessible in a way it had never been before. They went through every page. They indexed every name. They created timelines and cross-referenced witness statements. It sounds like clerical work, and in a sense, it was. But clerical work on a cold case is the foundation that everything else rests on. When you're working a murder that's 40 years old, the ability to search a name across every document in the file, to find a connection between a 1983 interview and a 1990 follow-up and a 2005 review, that's the difference between seeing the picture and staring at loose pieces. Michigan State Police described the students as integral to solving the case. While the students organized the paper trail, the MSP's Forensic Science Division partnered with Othram Labs, a Texas-based company that specializes in forensic-grade genome sequencing. Othram's technology can extract usable DNA profiles from evidence that is old, degraded, or present in quantities too small for traditional testing. They took the biological evidence from Sheri's case, evidence that had been collected in 1983 and stored for 40 years, and developed a DNA profile of the unknown suspect. The profile pointed to a man named Ronnie Collins. He was 75 years old, living in Grand Blanc, a city about 6 miles south of Flint. He had lived in the same area as Sheri Jo Elliott at the time of her disappearance. He was a traveling musician who played in bars around the region. He would have been about 33 years old in November 1983 when Sheri walked to the bus stop and never came home. A bar owner named Lisa Baker, who knew Collins from one of the establishments where he played, described him to a local news station as one of the nicest guys she'd ever met. A musician, a regular, a friendly face behind a guitar. The kind of person you'd sit next to at the bar and share a conversation with and never once think about the thing he'd done 40 years ago in a shed or a basement or wherever he kept a 16-year-old girl. For 3 days before shooting her. He played music in the same region where Sheri Jo lived and died. He was part of the scenery. But before investigators could approach Collins for a voluntary DNA sample, something happened. Somewhere in the process of building the case, as detectives narrowed their focus and prepared to make contact, Collins became aware that the investigation was closing in on him. In January 2026, Ronnie Collins killed himself. He was 75 years old. He had lived free for 43 years after abducting, assaulting, and shooting a 16-year-old girl. And when the walls began to close, he chose to end his life rather than face what he'd done. He never explained himself. He never confessed. He never gave the family the one thing they wanted most, which was to hear him say why. DNA was collected during Collins's autopsy. The MSP Forensic Science Division analyzed it and compared it to the evidence recovered from Sheri Jo Elliott's body in 1983. The samples matched conclusively. Ronnie Collins was the man who had taken Sheri from that bus stop, held her for 3 days, assaulted her, shot her 4 times, and left her in a ditch 35 miles from her home. On April 13, 2026, Michigan State Police announced that the case was solved. Although Collins would never face prosecution, detectives said the identification provided long-awaited answers to Elliott's family and the community. The students from Western Michigan University who had helped crack the case were roughly the same age Sheri Jo was when she died. They'd spent months handling the documents from her case, reading the witness statements, looking at the evidence logs, knowing that somewhere in those pages was a 16-year-old girl who never got to grow up. When the DNA match was confirmed, they learned about it 2 months before the public announcement. For students in a college classroom, that's not an academic exercise. That's holding the answer to a family's 43-year-old question and waiting for the right moment to share it. Sheri Jo Elliott's aunt, Judy Sika, received the news from Sheri's mother, Joyce. She said she couldn't believe it. She said, for the families that have lost someone and don't have answers, don't give up hope. Because it's there. 3 days, that's the number I keep coming back to. Sheri Jo Elliott was alive for 3 days after she was taken. She was somewhere in the area, held by a man who played guitar in local bars and lived 6 miles from her house. While her family searched and police canvassed and posters went up in store windows, she was alive. And then she wasn't. And the man who took her went back to his life, played his music, smiled at bartenders, and carried his secret for 43 years, until the day a team of college students opened his file and a lab in Texas read his DNA. He never answered for any of it. He made sure of that. But his name is on the record now, and Sheri Jo Elliott's family has the one thing that eluded them for more than 4 decades. They know. Case 10. The Bear Brook Murders. In November 1985, a hunter walking through Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, about 10 miles outside of Concord, came across a metal barrel in the woods. It was partially hidden in the undergrowth, the kind of industrial drum you'd see at a construction site or behind a warehouse. He looked inside. The barrel contained the skeletal remains of a woman and a young girl. Police responded. They processed the scene. They examined the remains. Both victims had been killed by blunt force trauma. Both had been placed in the barrel together, sealed inside, and left in the woods. Based on the state of decomposition, investigators estimated they had been killed sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s. But beyond that, they had almost nothing. There was no identification on either body, no missing persons report that matched, no suspect, no motive, and no connection to anyone in the area. Nobody knew who the woman was, nobody knew who the child was, and nobody knew who had put them in that barrel. The case sat unsolved for 15 years. Then, in May of 2000, an investigator returned to the same stretch of woods on a follow-up visit. About 300 feet from where the first barrel had been found, partially buried in the ground, he discovered a second barrel. Inside were the remains of two more girls. One was estimated to be around 9 years old. The other was between 2 and 4. 4 bodies, 2 barrels, found 15 years apart, 300 feet from each other, all killed by blunt force trauma, all from roughly the same era, the late 70s or early 80s, and not a single one of them had a name. Bear Brook was different from every other cold case you've ever heard of, and here's why. In most unsolved murders, investigators know who the victim is. They know the name, the address, the family, the circle of people who might have wanted to hurt them. The question is, who did it? At Bear Brook, investigators didn't even have that starting point. They had 4 bodies and 0 identities. They had no names for the victims, no name for the killer, no idea how any of these people were connected to each other or to the park where they were found. It was a murder case with no characters, just remains and drums in the New Hampshire woods. For years, the case went nowhere. Forensic artists created reconstructions of the victims' faces. The images were distributed nationally. Tips came in and led to dead ends. The case became one of the most well-known Jane Doe mysteries in the country, discussed on forums and message boards by amateur sleuths who spent years trying to match the reconstructed faces to missing persons databases. And none of it worked. The first breakthrough came in 2017, and it rewrote the rules of criminal investigation. Using a forensic technique called genetic genealogy, something that had never been used to identify a criminal suspect before, investigators were able to put a name to the killer. His name was Terry Petter Rasmussen, born in Denver in 1943, and nobody had ever heard of him because Terry Rasmussen almost never used his real name. Over the course of his life, Rasmussen used at least 6 known aliases: Robert Evans, Curtis Mayo Kimball, Gordon Jensen, Lawrence Vanner, Gerald Mockerman. He drifted across the country, from California to New Hampshire, to Arizona to Virginia, reinventing himself in every new town, attaching himself to women, and then disappearing when things got complicated. Investigators would later call him the chameleon killer because his ability to shed identities and vanish into new ones was unlike anything they had encountered. Rasmussen didn't live long enough to be confronted with the Bear Brook evidence. He died in a California prison in 2010 while serving a sentence for the murder of his girlfriend, Yoon Soon Jun, in 2002. He was 67 years old. He went to his grave as a convicted killer of one person, and the full scope of what he'd done wouldn't emerge for another 7 years. But the Bear Brook barrels weren't the only trail Rasmussen left behind. He is also the prime suspect in the 1981 disappearance of Denise Baudin, a 23-year-old New Hampshire woman who was his girlfriend at the time. When Baudin vanished, Rasmussen took her young daughter and raised her under a false identity for years, telling people the child was his. DNA testing later confirmed the girl was not his biological daughter. He had simply taken her, an entire childhood built on a dead woman's absence and a stolen identity. The girl grew up not knowing who she really was or what had happened to her mother. Wherever Rasmussen went, people vanished, and because he never stayed in one place long enough under one name, nobody connected the disappearances until the science caught up with the man. After Rasmussen was identified as the Bear Brook killer in 2017, the next question was the one that had haunted the case from the beginning. Who were the 4 people in those barrels? The answer came from 2 directions at once, and neither one involved a police detective. Rebecca Heath was a research librarian in Connecticut. She'd become fascinated with the Bear Brook case after listening to a podcast about it produced by New Hampshire Public Radio. On her own time, using nothing but an internet connection and a methodical research approach, Heath started searching online message boards for people looking for missing family members. She typed in keywords like California and missing sister, and worked through lists of results, checking each one against public records to see if the person had been found or was still missing. Eventually, she came across a family searching for a woman named Marlize Honeychurch and her daughters. Heath dug deeper. She contacted family members, and one of them mentioned that the last time they saw Marlize, she had introduced them to a new boyfriend. His name was Terry Rasmussen. Heath submitted her tip to law enforcement on October 12, 2018. She later said she couldn't believe the connection she'd found. "There is no way that's a coincidence," she said. "This is huge." At the same time, Heath was working the message boards. A genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter was independently using the victims' DNA to trace their identities. Ray Venter was already famous in forensic circles for her role in identifying the Golden State Killer. For the Bear Brook case, she used a cutting-edge technique that the field had considered impossible, extracting autosomal DNA from rootless hair strands. Autosomal DNA lives inside the cell nucleus, and conventional wisdom held that it couldn't be recovered from hair that was no longer attached to the root. But a California lab had been working on a method to reassemble the broken fragments. After months of trial and error, it worked. In June 2019, authorities announced the identification of 3 of the 4 victims. The woman in the first barrel was Marlize Elizabeth Honeychurch, 24 years old. The 2 girls found in the second barrel were her daughters, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn, approximately 9, and Sarah Lynn McWaters, approximately 2. They had different biological fathers, but they shared the same mother. Marlize and her daughters were last seen in California in November 1978, the same month she introduced her family to her new boyfriend, Terry Rasmussen. After that introduction, nobody in the family ever saw Marlize or her girls again, but there was still one victim without a name. The 4th child, the one investigators had been calling the middle child because of her estimated age relative to the other 2 girls, was between 2 and 4 years old at the time of death. DNA testing had already confirmed she was not biologically related to Marlize or her daughters. She was, however, the biological daughter of Terry Rasmussen. He killed his own child, put her in a barrel, and left her in the woods. For 6 more years, the middle child remained unidentified. Investigators knew who her father was. They knew he was the killer, but they didn't know who her mother was, and without that connection, they couldn't give the girl a name. In early 2024, the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit partnered with the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit organization that uses volunteer genetic genealogists to identify unknown remains. The team assigned to the case faced a problem that most genealogy investigations don't encounter. The child's DNA had no close matches in any public database. There were no relatives who had submitted samples that would produce an obvious family connection. The genealogists had to go deep. Over the course of 18 months, the DNA Doe Project team built a family tree containing roughly 25,000 names. 25,000. They traced the child's ancestry backward through generations, following genetic connections through birth records, marriage certificates, census documents, and obituaries, until they reached a couple born in the 1780s, more than 2 centuries before the child was murdered. From that couple, they worked forward through 8 generations of descendants until the tree narrowed to a woman who had died in 2005. Her obituary listed a surviving daughter named Pepper Reed. Investigators located Rhea's birth certificate in Orange County, California. It was issued in 1976, It listed her parents as Pepper Reed and Terry Rasmussen. On September 5, 2025, after confirming the identity through documentary records and DNA testing of a family member, authorities officially identified the middle child as Rhea Rasmussen. She was approximately 3 years old when she was killed. Her mother, Pepper Reed, was born in 1952 in Texas. She has not been seen since the late 1970s. No one reported her missing at the time, and no police report was ever filed. She simply stopped existing in any public record, and for decades, the absence went unnoticed. Investigators now believe she is likely another victim of Terry Rasmussen, though her remains have never been found. The search for Pepper Reed continues. Authorities have asked anyone with information about her whereabouts or Rasmussen's movements between 1974 and 1985 to come forward. At a press conference on September 8, 2025, New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella said the words the case had been waiting 4 decades to hear. This case has weighed on New Hampshire and the nation for decades. With Rhea Rasmussen's identification, all 4 victims now have their names back. Senior Assistant Attorney General Benjamin Agati stood beside him and said something that every person who had worked the case, from the original investigators to the librarian in Connecticut to the genealogists who built a tree of 25,000 names, had earned the right to hear. He said, "Today, we're no longer frustrated. We can find ourselves for once, just today, fulfilled, because we have that name, and it feels like a promise kept. 4 bodies in 2 barrels, found 15 years apart in a New Hampshire state park. For decades, the victims had no names. The killer had no face. The connections between them were invisible. And it took a hunter, a librarian, a genetic genealogist who figured out how to pull DNA from a strand of hair, a family tree stretching back to the 1780s, and 40 years of stubborn, patient, relentless work to give 4 people their names back. Marlice Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, Sarah McWaters, Rhea Rasmussen. They were in the woods the whole time. They just needed someone to say who they were. 10 cases, 10 answers that took decades to arrive. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.